Northfield, Tinian, 9th of March, 1945, late afternoon. Heat shimmered over coral and asphalt, while 4 parallel 8,000-foot runways pointed like bayonets toward the sea. Every 50 yards, a bomb dolly rattled by, as if the island were a factory with waves for walls. Crew Chief Morales, one of thousands of hands who kept super fortresses honest, chalked meeting house on the nose wheel door as the trade wind flicked canvas covers and made aluminum skins hum. Major Sam Tex Ellison watched the last safety wires twist tight and felt the new doctrine settle in his shoulders. No more pride flights in the jet stream. Tonight it was night, low and heavy with fire. Inside the pressurized forward cabin, the flight engineer ran limits by touch, manifold pressure steady, 2,550 RPM, cowl flaps cracked, while the navigator squared his wind triangle against a strip map whose right margin was ocean. On the hardstand, armourers muscled E-46 clusters toward the bomb bays, each a 500-pound canister that would split in the slipstream and scatter 38 M-69s. The men respected those pipes of jellied gasoline. They punched through tile and paper, delayed 3 to 5 seconds, then vomited flame that stuck to floors and stairs. Someone said the ground would burn like coal. No one joked. 3 wings, 73rd, 313th, 314th, were committed. Across Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, more than 300 B-29s were being readied, a mass that thumped like a drum under the heat. The Seabees who carved these runways from coral moved trucks and tractors with a choreography so practiced it looked instinct. A month earlier, crews had been thrown out of formation by the jet stream. Tonight, General Curtis E. LeMay ordered humility. Strip the side turrets, keep the tail, trade armour for fuel and fire. If they were seen, the answer would be speed and darkness. Ellison ran a gloved hand over the central fire control site that would sit quiet all night. It had been built to command 4 remote turrets through a ballet of servos. Now it was just weight saved and drag avoided. Relief lived in simplicity. They would ride low where winds slackened, where the APQ-13 radar read coastline like a heartbeat, where the bombardier could toggle on a flaming mark. He checked his crew. The bombardier, toggle switch man, really tonight, had rehearsed the intervalometer settings until the numbers felt like scripture. Open at the X, walk the pattern with the wind. The radio operator folded a typed sheet of brevity codes and tucked it away. Silence was doctrine. The left gunner, grounded, was reassigned as an extra loader and wore the loss like a rock in his boot. Outside, Morales thumped a bulky bomb bay latch with the heel of his hand and laughed when it seated. The humour was small but real, the sort of grin crews remember years later. Dusk leaned across the Marianas. Weather arrived on clipped voices from a damp paper hut, unseasonable dryness over the Kanto plain, winds freshening after midnight. The forecast read like an ally. Ellison stepped onto the ladder and looked aft along the cold tunnel that joined the pressurized compartments. He thought of the ocean leg, the green glow of the scope, the radius democracy bought with avgas, and 4 Wright R335Os whose idle thrums felt like horses shouldering a load. He let training quiet the doubt he would not name. Engines started in sequence left to right, prop wash whipping grit against ankles. Taxi lines formed, a conveyor. The first superfortress rolled, nose light off, and climbed into the trade wind like a barn door taught to fly. Ellison's turn came. He eased the throttles forward and felt the airframe flex to life. The centerline became a promise rather than paint. Weight, speed, and lift bargained, and the bargain held. They lifted. The ocean was a sheet of hammered lead, the horizon a seam. The engineer called good temperatures and pressures, and the pilot set cruise. Behind them, the island shrank but did not sleep. Fuel bowsers circled, bomb trains rattled. One base ran 4 runways and hundreds of hardstands, launching more heavy bombers in one night than some nations built in a year. Abundance was not a slogan here, it was motion, counted in gallons and man-hours. The crew settled into the long leg north. Oil and hot aluminum gave way to the sanitized smell of pressurized air and the quiet tick of cooling skins. Tomorrow the world would tally what happened over Tokyo and argue morality. Tonight the math was simple. Speed over the water, dark air under the wings, intervalometers set to a cadence that would teach fire to behave like a weapon. The compass settled. The airplane pointed at a city that had no idea how precisely it had been studied. Tokyo's Shitamachi, 9 March 1945, early evening. The river smelled of soy, fish, and the faint metal of low tide. Lanterns were hooded for blackout, and wind came restless along the Sumida, combing laundry lines until they sang. Civil Defence Warden Keiko Arai walked a lane barely wide enough for a handcart with her whistle tucked into a sash and a notebook of names, ticking rooftops as if attendance could stop a war. She checked cistern pumps, counted buckets, and noted which ladders were missing rungs. In courtyards, she reminded families to keep a tub full. Water could not be invented once sparks arrived. The neighbourhoods were tidy grids in city ledgers, but no map showed how closely wood leaned into wood. Houses of lath, paper and cedar shingles left lanes like capillaries. Workshops were kitchens. Kitchens were assembly lines. A tailor's table doubled as a bench for drilling spring clips. A child's homework trembled from the treadle-stamping washers for a factory no one had ever seen. The war had moved into parlours and onto tatami mats, into single rooms warmed by brazier coals that would, on the wrong night, serve a larger flame. At the ward office, she had learned to call this dispersed manufacture, proof of resilience. Privately, she thought the city had turned to powder and wire burned. Training manuals were practiced. Bucket brigades on the lee side, sand on embers, wet blankets across eaves, alleys kept clear for engines. She carried the instructions like prayer. Firemen did the same, running drills around couplings worn smooth by hands. Even the bamboo pike boys in white armbands recited their parts, though their sticks were only sticks. A neighbour bowed and asked about tomorrow's ration rice. Keiko said the shipment would arrive by noon if the railhead did not jam. A radio droned with news that sounded like yesterday's news, and a grandmother tapped ashes from a pipe and muttered that the wind smelled wrong. Down by the canal, a fisherman lit a cigarette against his palm. She tilted her head, and he pinched it out with a nod. Above the eaves, a cloud was not a cloud, but city breath under a lid. On the roof of the textile storehouse, she traced the river's bend. South, a low haze shaded the night. She had seen the other maps, the ones few borrowed, drawn from insurance assessments and inventories, blocks graded not for value, but for how well they would burn. She had touched the paper and felt, to her shame, that it was clever. Somewhere, men with rulers had already planned how the wind would be asked to help the bombs. When the first distant engines entered, hearing they came as rumour in the darkness, a slow pulse that might have been surf. She paused, listened, decided it was nothing, then heard it again, a second line threading the first. She raised her whistle halfway without blowing. Warnings had come before. The Americans had flown high in winter, where winds were knives, and bombs had fallen like anger that could not find a door. Tonight the wind was not a knife. It was a hand, open and insistent. She made the rounds with a quicker step. Water lids must be pulled, ladders propped, rooftop watch posted, children bundled into coats. The ward telephone rang twice and died. Somewhere she could not see, pathfinders were preparing to lay an X of fire across the wards she knew by smell. She did not think of letters. She thought of faces and doors and of drills repeated until they felt like superstition. At the cul-de-sac where 3 alleys met, the sky offered nothing but dark, yet the sound grew teeth. It came in lines, not like one airplane, but like a seam being unzipped uphill. From a roof, an old man shouted that the night smelled of gasoline. She wanted to say no, it was river and lantern oil, but the denial broke against her teeth. She lifted the whistle and blew one long, two short, then sent the bamboo pike boys to the pump. In kitchens, women tied scarves over hair and set buckets by doors. In yards, dogs vanished. The canal riffled with a warm varnish stink that did not belong to water. Keiko would remember the small things first: a sock with a careful darn, the taste of dust when she called the roll, the way bucket handles clanked in imperfect unison like a temple bell rehearsing. Only later would she learn the larger order, the choice to come low, to come at night, to bring fire in a pattern calculated to unite with wind and wood. Tonight the city leaned toward the river as if water were a promise. In another hour, that promise would burn. Chofu Airfield outside Tokyo, twilight, 9th of March, 1945. Lieutenant Satoshi Kume ran a hand over the Ki-45 Toryu's nacelle and felt sand under paint. A crew chief dipped a wood stick into a tank and frowned at the damp mark. "That's the gas," he said, and did not add, "all." Armourers counted 20mm shells into drums, as if counting beads for prayer. The pilot's checklist felt heavier with each thumbed page because fuel looked like time and the clock was poor. Briefing had been a chalk circle around the capital. Intercepts would be visual, aided if possible by searchlights and the radar that sometimes spoke and sometimes fell mute. The 1st Anti-Aircraft Division claimed many guns. At night their fire was a net with large holes. Ground-controlled interception, when it worked, called headings to engine glow. The squadron leader, voice thin with static, said the enemy had been flying high, but reports suggested a change, lower altitudes. He hesitated, then said the word incendiaries in a way that left taste in the room. Kume started the starboard engine, then port, letting the props chew dust and dusk. He thought of climb performance and of the line where rate of climb intersected fuel flow and left him with not enough to fight and land. He glanced at a photograph of his wife tucked under a clipboard strap and slid it further from the open window. He did not plan for heroics, he planned for headings, for closure, for a single firing pass held a heartbeat longer than fear advised. He signed for the aircraft and saluted the line chief because courtesy held its shape even when doctrine did not. Controllers spoke in clipped phrases. Reports from the coast were thin and contradictory. The city sky began to brighten from within, a false dawn rising in the east, as if a storm were walking ashore without rain. The first arc of searchlight found only haze and ash, and then went blind as smoke rolled back through its beam. The radio coughed bearing and range. Kume eased the throttles and watched the needle drop in the glass bowl like a verdict. Climbing toward the glow, the Ki-45 felt honest and heavy. He set mixture by ear because the gauge lagged, and he trimmed for hands-off because he would need fingers for switches. Below, guns began to thud like doors closing in a huge house. Bursts climbed, the bursts found nothing. The air itself moved strangely. Updrafts slapped his wings as if the sky objected to his intentions. A bomber, low and sliding, passed 1,000 meters to starboard, an ember with a spine. He turned to chase, and the fuel needle turned with him. The ground loomed not as earth, but as texture, lines of fire running alleys, sparks pulled flat by a wind that had found purpose. He told himself the pilot ahead would commit an error. He told himself his own cannon would not jam. He told himself the controller would speak a heading that shortened the distance between intention and deed. The controller gave silence instead. The next call was a warning: conserve fuel. He understood that the warning was not for safety, but for arithmetic. An airplane that flamed out on final made a problem someone would have to lift with ropes. He pulled into a climbing turn to keep altitude in the bank and found the bomber now a red smear under a lid of heat. He could not see the ship to shoot and could not afford the circle to try again. He rolled wings level and called the field. The reply was clipped and kind. Return. Save the machine. The words were mercy and sentence at once. Descending, he saw the city as a single wound. He flattened his approach to spare fuel and felt the tires kiss early. He taxied past other Ki-45s that would not go up tonight because their tanks had been drunk by trucks, by generators, by 100 hungers more urgent than interception. Before dawn, he would learn numbers that felt impossible. Across a single night, American bombers had made more than 1 million people homeless, a sum that no fighter in the world could fly against. He shut down, and the props wound down to stillness, and in the quiet he could hear the fire. Approach to Tokyo, late night, 9th of March, 1945. The ocean was ink, and the Kanto coast rose on the APQ-13 scope as a thin necklace that brightened and faded with each sweep. Ellison eased the B-29 to 6,000 feet, a guns-light bomb-heavy airplane that felt like a decision you could touch. Pressurization held. The cabin carried the faint rubber and ozone smell of heated wiring. Above the bombardier's toggle, a paper strip was taped like a catechism. E46/38 times M69/3 to 5 second delay /walk with wind/overlap. The radio stayed disciplined silent. The pilot's left hand kept a feather of pressure on the yoke to ride bumps that twitched like something under the skin. The airplane's voice was steady, manifold where it should be, props a patient buzz, cowl flaps cracked to keep the engines honest. They had been told to trust the mark. Pathfinders would go first, lay a flaming X across Honjo and Fukagawa, and the main force would build on that cross the way painters grid a canvas. Insurance underwriters had once graded those wards by how well they would burn. OSS men had turned actuarial geometry into targeting prophecy. Ellison crossed the bay lights out, lean mixture buying minutes of fuel. The flight engineer touched gauges like a rosary. The navigator murmured headings and times, grease pencil squeaking as if arithmetic protested the work it had to do. The first stroke appeared as a dash of orange, lengthening as if a hot iron dragged across the city. A second bar swelled until there it was, an X, its arms drifting with gusts like banners in a stadium no one cheered. "Doors," Ellison said. "Open," the engineer answered, and the belly unzipped with a tug the harness relayed to ribs. "Ready." "On." The bombardier slid the luminous crosshair a shade high to let wind carry the bomblets into the geometry. When the mark slipped beneath the nose, his thumb settled the toggle. Bombs don't fall with drama in a superfortress, not the way a man expects, but the airframe did a small, relieved shiver each time a 500-pound E-46 cluster left the racks. The ship rose a thumb width. Ellison trimmed it out. The intervalometer kept time like a metronome that had read the plan. Below, impacts thumped through roofs. M69s punched tile and paper, lay as if thinking it over, then vomited napalm that crawled under doors and down stairwells. Alleyways turned to flues. The river caught spots of orange and tugged them like lanterns in a slow parade. The X became a living compass, its arms thickening until borders were only ideas. Ellison walked his drop with the wind so footprints overlapped and no fire brigade could find a seam to fight. Quartering gusts worried the tail. He held a whisper of rudder to keep straight. The altimeter ticked as hot air poured at the ship. Back aft, the lone remaining turret stared into a furnace without a silhouette to justify its purpose, an elegant machine on a night that didn't need guns. LeMay's wager had followed them into the cockpit. Mass, weather, and the physics of combustion would do more at 6,000 feet than courage could do at 30,000. Winter had scattered formations like startled sheep and wrote their efforts into the jet stream. Down here, the sentences were short and terrible. The city below still looked like breakfasts and quarrels, and socks hung to dry. It also looked, to the indifferent math of war, like fuel arranged by human convenience into perfect cartography. They crossed the mark again on a slight offset, stacking a second swath onto the first, so embers became an organism. Smoke reached up in ropes. The prop arcs flickered like film. Hot air steals power. The engineer took 1/2 inch of manifold, Ellison countered with a nudge of trim, and both men listened with their hands for any note that meant the engines wanted mercy. The navigator drew a clean exit line. The radio operator logged only what the record would need because words were rationed too. He could not see Keiko Arai's whistle clenched between her teeth or hear hose lines go limp. He could not see Lieutenant Satoshi Kume circling on fumes, sliding past a glow that erased bearings. He saw rectangles become fields and then something beyond geometry. "Last stick," the bombardier said. "Doors coming," the engineer answered. The racks thumped empty, a heartbeat finishing its run, and the belly shut with a shiver. Ellison turned for the bay and did not look back immediately. There were headings to set, altitudes to regain, lives to protect in the simple, practical sense. When he did look, the city had become a single lung, ragged at the edges, inhaling oxygen and exhaling flame. Interphone stayed quiet. Language felt like an intruder. Numbers, square miles, buildings, dead, would come later and would be believed because the men who wrote them would have ash in their cuffs and the taste of it in their mouths. Climb, hold, turn for home. The mark was doing the rest. The first bomblets came as a patter across roofs, small thumps the mind tried to file as rain, then as hail, until heat refused both names. An M69 punched through a paper wall and lay on a floor where a child had left a wooden top. Its fuse burned to a thought, and then the room bloomed in orange. Buckets lifted and water turned to steam halfway to the eaves. Men shouted for the lee side, just like the manual, and the manual, for a breath, worked. Then alleyways breathed like chimneys, and everything that had been tidy became wind. Engines arrived with their bells, polished brass wheels, neat couplings, and then the promises died. Hoses went soft when mains lost pressure. A captain flagged crews down alleys and into back gardens, buying seconds at the price of streets, and seconds turned bankrupt. The canal took fire like lacquer touched with a brush. Flames skimmed the surface faster than a man could run. Keiko shoved a door and found a family inside, faces blacked with soot, bowls of water shaking in their hands as if that tremor could quench heat. She herded them outward until the lane itself hissed and lifted them toward a stone stair that still breathed air. The sound changed. It stopped being many small fires and became one voice, a note so deep it lived under the skin. Oxygen left rooms and shelters. People fainted not from smoke but from nothingness. Roof tiles fell in rows like disciplined soldiers. Somewhere a warehouse door went outward in a bright cough, and the street gulped flame. Keiko grabbed a girl by the sleeve and aimed her toward the canal. She saw the slick burning there and veered for the quay, where wind came in fierce sheets, but at least came. In the pocket behind a wall, an old man drenched a towel and tied it across his mouth. "The manuals say the wind veers," he said. She nodded because agreement can be a kind of medicine. Above them glowing brands swept like kites, aloft on currents no kite would love. The wall shuddered with a gust and language broke. Gestures carried meaning forward. Keiko lifted the girl and carried her until her arms trembled, then handed her to a boy with a bamboo pike who held it like a standard. From the riverfront, the fire was a machine. It made its own weather, bending air into loops that fed it and sent it racing. A carnival ride built by physics and cruelty conspiring in plain sight. Seaward, the sky wore the ugly beauty of a forge. Inland, a worse beauty, the memory of a forest returning as fuel. Keiko thought of the ward list in her notebook and of paper's first life as pulp and tree. Everything here had origins that explained how easily it surrendered to heat. A fireman stumbled near her with a length of hose that twitched like an exhausted snake. He said the engines were gone and the crews with them. 14 minutes after the worst glow began, the fight had become escape. She believed him because he looked at the river as if expecting it to apologize. She split her group. sending half to the packed dirt of the schoolyard that might resist embers, half to the stone quay whose wind at least was honest. She took the middle herself, where choices could pivot. She would later be told numbers that chafed sense. Roughly 16 square miles burned before dawn, 267,000 buildings gone, nearly 1 million people made homeless in a single night. The mind that can count buckets refused that scale. Her palm on a child's shoulder understood only smaller arithmetic. Steps to the stair, breaths to the corner, how many bowls left. She saw a wall of flame cross a street without touching the ground, a sheet of red pulled horizontal by gale, and learned that water did not have a monopoly on flowing. In a cellar she found heat like a furnace's exhale and closed the door because the living watched. The whistle between her teeth tasted of brass and fear. When she finally blew it, the sound was a thin line drawn across a page already blackened, and people followed the line because lines still meant order, and order, for a few breaths, meant life. The horizon ahead was ink, the one behind was an anvil, glowing at the edges. Ellison climbed to steadier air, and the airplane breathed easier as convective fists loosened their grip. He kept power conservative because the night had more miles in it than any man's nerves. The engineer called fuel remaining in numbers that fit the plan. The navigator laid down fixes along a coast he could no longer see but still believed in, because the scope showed it in patient pulses. The radio operator listened to guard and to the hiss that fills all silences at sea. Over water, the smell of burned city thinned but did not leave. Soot arced the leading edges. Oil mist filmed the glass until stars turned to hesitant coins. A voice on guard, calm, fast with salt in it, gave coordinates for a ditching. Lights in the swell, parachutes sighted, ability to assist limited while on station. Ellison wrote the last 3 digits of the tail number on his knee because the act felt like respect. Somewhere behind their stern, a submarine changed course by inches that would decide lives. He did not yet know the numbers that would be typed at dawn. He did not know the firm count of American losses, about 14 bombers, roughly 96 airmen, or the Japanese losses he could not see for flame. He knew only that their side still had airplanes, engines, crews, fuel, enough to replace machines and men that vanished between takeoff and breakfast. He also knew, pebble in boot certain, that arithmetic could not replace the people under those roofs. Victory and grief could ride the same ledger line without contradiction. The Marianas returned as a friendly glow, a necklace of lights strung across coral. Landing pattern was a conga line of aluminum and fatigue. Touchdown came with a hop they would deny in debrief because pride was a useful adhesive. Taxi in, props to low pitch, mixture to cut off one by one, and the engines shuddered, sighed, and quit. Quiet had weight. The crew smelled themselves, sweat, oil, a hint of ash in the cloth. The airplane wore soot streaks like war paint. Debrief was ritual. Coffee that tasted like penance, clipboards, a board map strung with threads. Altitudes? 5 to 9,000. Turbulence? Severe in places. Flames to what height? Hard to tell. Updraft hit us like a wave. Fighters sighted? Maybe. Mostly heat. Doors? Functioned. Losses? 2 from our group, 1 ditched, 1 not back. Smell in the cabin? Burned city. The intelligence captain wrote without comment and turned the page with fingers that shook only when they reached for more paper. On the line, Crew Chief Morales had rags and solvent ready. He checked bomb bay latches, fasteners, the small things a mechanic trusts more than speeches. Across the field, a truck arrived with a lifeboat cradled across its bed. A crew climbed down, wet and sheepish and very alive. A cheer went up that had no lyric and needed none. Men moved back to tents or bunks and found sleep difficult. Some smelled smoke in their hair and did not decide whether it was the airplanes or their own imagining. LeMay did not sleep. He stood over a table where area burned settled at 15.8, then was rounded to 16. Buildings destroyed, about 267,000. Dead, 87,900 something for the moment, with a paragraph for uncertainty that could hold 10,000 more. Homeless rounded to a 7-figure cruelty. In roughly 6 hours, a quarter of the world's largest city by 1940 census was erased while the attacking force lost about 14 aircraft, an exchange so lopsided it felt like a misprint until you smelled the ash on men's cuffs. The impossible statistic sat in the middle of the room and changed how every other number looked. A single mission had unmade more homes in a night than some campaigns touched in months. The war would not end here, but its trajectory bent under physics, fuel, and doctrine drafted in the language of mass. Orders went out for Nagoya. On the hard stands, Bowsers moved. In the barracks, men dreamed, woke, and tried to dream again. Ellison lay down and saw the flaming X when he closed his eyes. In Tokyo, a woman in a ward office started a new list in a room that no longer had walls. The fighter direction hut smelled of hot dust and metal filings, a room built for certainty, now bargaining with static. Bearings came in like half-remembered addresses. Searchlights clawed at a sky that refused to hold still. Beams slid off smoke and found only their own reflection. Batteries under the 1st Anti-Aircraft Division barked into the dark, their tracers blown sideways by gusts that made geometry dishonest. In the Ki 45 Toryu, Kume held his climb until the needle on fuel began to look like time running backward. The controller's voice would have sounded confident on a clearer night. Now it sounded practical. Headings, altitudes, conserve. Updrafts shouldered the twin-engined fighter, shoving it into moments of weightlessness, then down again into pockets heavy as wet cloth. Coombe trimmed by instinct and kept his hands light because the sky did not reward force. He saw a bomber only once in clean silhouette, a silver ember sliding across the glow, and he felt how fast an airplane can look when the air in front of it is already burning. He banked to intercept, cannon armed and certain for half a breath that fate had finally slowed to his speed. The gun sight ring refused to keep the target. The fuel needle reached for the floor of its glass. Below, a captain with a rangefinder cursed the wind that moved his spotting rounds like gossip. His crews were good men, practiced, the sort who could load shells in their sleep and often had. But sleep had not trained the air. Night fire control was a polite term for guessing at angles while heat composed its own weather. Bursts walked past openings where the B-29s should have been if the city itself had not learned to bend light. The captain ordered a ceasefire to stop wasting ammunition into the glow, and for a moment the noise of the raid fell to wind and burning and the single cough of a gun that did not hear the order. Fuel was the new general. Kume acknowledged the recall with a clipped high because courtesy endures even when combat does not. He hated the word return the way a man hates a locked door in his own house. He feathered his climb into a descending arc that saved distance and innocence and aimed for the strip at Chofu. The field's lanterns looked like a negotiated truce with the night. He could not know that across Tokyo men were crawling into canals to breathe through wet cloth while the water above them burned. He could smell it, a sweet varnish note that slipped into the cockpit and made words unnecessary. He touched down long and light and rode the brakes as if they were fragile things, which they were. Taxiing past the line, he counted silhouettes that would not fly because trucks had drunk their fuel to carry generators that spun radios to call fighters that could not climb for lack of the fuel the trucks had carried. Scarcity had invented its own circle. He shut down, let the props scythe to stillness, and sat with his hands on his knees until silence finished expanding. When he climbed out, the crew chief didn't ask questions he couldn't answer. The man only patted the nacelle twice and nodded toward the ready room, where coffee would be boiled until it resembled courage. At the division headquarters, a colonel read reports that insisted on arithmetic even while the room smelled of Tokyo's ash. Night fighters committed, not enough. Intercepts completed, too few. B-29 losses. Some, but not what the mind required to count as influence. The colonel followed doctrine to its edges and found the edge had moved. Electronics with names everyone mispronounced would have helped, fuel would have helped, altitude would have helped, but the enemy had declined to cooperate with any of those remedies. He folded the last report and stared at the map of wards, where the flaming X had grown fat arms until borders were jokes. Kume would later stand beside the strip and watch dawn find the soot on his hands. He would think the obvious soldier's thought, that if he had just 10 minutes more gas, just one reliable vector, he could have pressed the trigger and ridden recoil into some other history. He would carry that thought like a flat stone in his pocket, turning it with his thumb on quiet mornings. The historians would write what he already knew. Several Japanese aircraft that night did not fall to enemies but to fuel, an absence as lethal as any bullet. Doctrine had not failed so much as arithmetic had won on the other side. When the telephone rang, summoning him for a daylight sweep that would likely find nothing worth finding, he answered because duty is not a mood. Outside, the last bright edges of the city's wound went dull, and somewhere a child coughed in the burned air of morning. On Tinian, the sun came up practical, laying a square of light across the maintenance line as if to remind men where their wrenches belonged. Crew Chief Morales had solvent and rags and a list he could have written in the dark. Inspect cowl flaps, check turbo gate travel, safety wire oil caps, look for burned paint on the leading edges that hinted at convective tantrums. The B-29 wore the raid in streaks and smears. Ash traced the path of airflow like fingerprints on glass. He ran a hand along the bomb bay doors and felt a tiny burr where the latch had stuck last night and seated under a punch. He smiled. Good airplane. Debrief had ended in numbers and sentences that would be stapled into history. Area burned approximately 16 square miles. Structures destroyed about 267,000. Dead not yet final, but already a town's worth of towns. LeMay stepped out of a tent that held those facts at attention and into a field that preferred verbs. Orders were verbs, fuel bowsers moved, bomb trains clanked. The CBs drove their graded roads as if each loop brought them closer to a boundary they meant to reach and then move. Logistics looked like abundance disguised as boredom. A truck brought coffee that tasted like punishment. Another hauled crates of fuses stenciled with neat warnings. A third delivered new brake linings because last night's hot landings had been harder than pride admitted. On a side pad, parachutes were repacked by hands that never saw the ocean into which those canopies sometimes flowered. In a corrugated hut, a meteorology sergeant drew arrows with a grease pencil and circled Nagoya in a red that looked festive if you didn't know what red meant here. The briefing board collected time, altitude, and a reminder that guns light would continue until results suggested otherwise. Ellison's crew slept like men whose nervous systems had been unbolted and set aside, then woke too early because quiet feels wrong after noise. They washed ash-off faces and laughed at nothing. The bombardier checked intervalometer cams as if they were rosary beads and rehearsed the touch of a toggle that decided geography. The flight engineer ran his palm over R3350's cowling with the proprietary affection of a man who knows the difference between warm and good. The radio operator wrote home. He mentioned weather and chow and omitted the smell because there are details a man spares a kitchen table thousands of miles away. In the harbour, a submarine that had been out last night slid to a buoy with men in blankets on her deck, survivors who would learn to tell the story without the parts that return in sleep. On Guam, a nurse taped a dressing over a man's hairline cut that bled like a better wound. She said he'd be fine and meant it as order more than prediction. On Saipan, a chaplain sat on a crate and stared through the palm fronds at nothing in particular for 20 minutes. On Tinian, a corporal inventoried flares by the simple method of counting until the number matched the tag. It would have shocked a visitor to learn that an island not much bigger than a county fairground could serve and launch hundreds of heavy bombers again within 24 hours, but shock wears off. The runway system, 4 parallel 8,000-foot strips at North Field, absorbed traffic like habit. Hard stands, hundreds, held aircraft as if a factory had spilled its assembly line onto coral. A planning major said aloud what his face had already confessed. The gear could do this again tomorrow and the day after. War, for the well-supplied, becomes a routine whose routineness is the point. When Ellison walked the line in the late afternoon, the ship looked clean enough to start its story over. He stowed a small tin of lozenges, the kind that cut through dry air in the throat, beside the throttles. He put the folded mission plan under a clip where it would not slide and tapped it twice because tapping made paper settle into obedience. Morales tightened a last safety wire and said, "She'll take you there and home again." Ellison said, "We'll do our part." They both believed both sentences. At briefing, the city name changed, and the method did not. A pathfinder would paint an opening on the map, the way a carpenter cuts a first board straight so the room will square itself. The main force would walk fire with the wind. Guns would remain mostly off because speed and altitude and night were still better armor than bullets. The men nodded, some because they agreed, some because nodding is easier than argument in a room where chairs scrape and pencils move. Outside, a breeze pulled at the tent flap like a reminder. The machine had slept, eaten, washed its face, and now stood ready to make more history look inevitable. The report wrote itself the way a tide lays down lines of weed and shell, inevitable as soon as the first wave turns. Area burned, 15.8 square miles, the intelligence captain typed, then rounded to 16 because the mind prefers whole numbers when the truth is already ragged. Buildings destroyed, approximately 267,171. Fatalities. Initial police estimate 87,793. Subsequent tallies likely to exceed 90,000. Margin of uncertainty acknowledged. Homeless, in excess of 1 million. He paused and felt his own hands in the room, the ash under the nails he had scrubbed until the skin went pink. Impartiality, like pressurization, had its leaks. LeMay read over a map stretched taut by pins. Honjo and Fukagawa no longer needed shading to suggest damage. The absence of streets did the work. He did not comment on the word deadliest the captain had tucked into a sentence with the care of a man handling a live fuse. It was accurate. It also threatened to turn the page into argument, and argument was for after victory. He spoke instead of tactics that had proven themselves under weather, of altitudes that had minimized winds and maximized ignition density, of the simple truth that guns removed had been bombs added and speed improved. The numbers of men returned mattered as arithmetic, but tonight the decisive arithmetic lived in square miles. In Tokyo, counting began with lists of names until lists surrendered to categories: missing, located, hospitalized, and finally to words like homeless that erase the particular because the particular no longer fits. A civil clerk opened a ledger and found it useless because the building around it had gone from office to open air. He wrote on the back of a calendar with a pencil dull enough to make the paper tear. An exhausted firefighter tallied engines lost and wrote the number small at the bottom of a page, embarrassed by its smallness compared to the loss above it. He was a man who believed in equipment's power to save, and equipment had been given a problem it could not solve. In Washington, analysts would later pair these numbers with ones from Detroit and Wichita and Omaha and see the shape of an equation that had seemed theoretical when the factories first lit overtime lamps. If a nation can assemble 3,970 B-29s in less than 3 years, can build the runways and fuel farms and docks to feed them, can train the crews and the crews who tend the crews, then a night like this is not an anomaly but a product. That was the revelation in the totals. The raid became a mirror held up to the arsenal of democracy, and what looked back was scale married to skill. The colonel at Fighter Command, poring over his losses and his not-quite losses, understood the equation from the other side. His pilots had flown well within the limits set by fuel, radar, weather, and chance. The limits were not patriotic, they were physical. He drafted recommendations the way a man drafts hope: more fuel, better radar, different tactics. He had written versions of the same memo for months. The paper accepted his pencil without objection and meant none of it. Ellison's crew saw the report only in slices, because aircrews absorb history at a pace that does not swamp sleep. A sergeant in the mess hall read the line about 16 square miles and whistled softly because he had grown up in a town exactly that size. He said so, and nobody at the table found a good answer to this coincidence. They ate in the quiet way men eat when the food is earnest and undeserving of complaint. Morales kept a copy of the buildings destroyed figure and tucked it into the back of a maintenance log, because sometimes the world needs to know that a wrench turned inside numbers that will look unreal in books. The impossible statistic sat like a guest who refuses to leave. In roughly 6 hours, one American mission had made more people homeless than some nations would displace in a year. It had burned an area larger than many capitals. It had done so with losses measured not in hundreds of aircraft, but in something like 14, a number that felt indecent beside 1,000,000. The mind reached for metaphor and found only math. The captain clicked the carriage return and began the next line. The paper rolled. The tide laid down another edge. The pins in the operations map multiplied, little brass heads that turned names into tasks. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, circles drawn in pencil grew into blackened bites as after-action photos returned with edges so clean they looked like they'd been trimmed with shears. The doctrine proved portable. Night, low, incendiary mass, winds recruited as accomplices. Wool and silk depots went up like singular candles that taught surrounding roofs how to burn. Rail yards learned to warp and seize. Cottage shops, thousands of kitchen lathes and hand presses, ceased to be factories because the kitchens were gone. LeMay's staff rotated fonts and phrasing to keep briefings from sounding like reruns. The men in the chairs heard sameness anyway, and that sameness was confidence. Altitudes held in the sweet spot between wind and flak. Loads favoured E-46 clusters until targets suggested M-47s or mixed sticks. Intervalometers were tuned to walk fire, not to scatter it. The tail turrets, left to watch the night as before, continued to find little to do because speed and darkness remained shield enough. It would have been vainglorious to say that technology and production had outrun an enemy's ability to react. It would also have been true. In the cities under the pins, dispersal plans did their best work and discovered that best was not enough. Factories sent tools and foremen to farm towns that needed rice more than jigs. Rail lines that were supposed to make such movements possible found themselves as brittle as sugar glass when heat arrived. A foreman in Aichi packed small dies into a trunk and reached a village where power existed as theory. He stowed the dies under his bed because there was nowhere to mount them and listened at night to the ghost breathing of a city that was not there. Fuel thinned the way language thins at a wake. Gasoline became second-hand story, the truck that didn't come, the barrel that was promised, the small drum that arrived under a tarp with no claim ticket and all the guilt that accompanies luck. Fighter pilots who had grown up on tales of martial valor learned to worship octane instead, and octane proved an unfaithful god. Batteries that had been built for parade discipline learned to pick their shots not because thrift was noble, but because supply was empty. When guns did fire, the bursts looked brave against a sky that knew where it was going. On the islands, the routine reached the point where routine frightened men who refused superstition. The more seamlessly the machine reset, the more it felt like they had tapped into something larger than effort, into a river. Morales could swap a turbo wastegate in less time than his first replacement had needed to find the right wrench. Ellison could recite engine-out procedures as if they were a bedtime story and offered them up to fate like homework finished before class. The navigator shaved seconds off fixes not to win a race, but because shaving seconds had become a creed. It is perhaps easier to say what changed than what stayed. What stayed? The hum of aluminum at taxi speed, the smell of avgas that crawled into clothes, the soft diplomacy with which air crew and ground crew reassured one another that each machine, each man, would perform. What changed? The tenor of intelligence summaries, which measured not struggle but pace, and the tone of the few Japanese broadcasts that squeezed through, which lost adjectives even as they gained volume. Nothing in total war should feel inevitable, and yet inevitability began to lean over the maps like weather. The Emperor's inspection tours moved through districts where smoke still rose from wet ash. His presence did not change physics, but it altered morale in ways paper struggles to bound. Behind palace walls, the word surrender began to move from profanity toward possibility, pulled by gravity made of square miles and weeks, of graphs that refused to reverse. In ward offices that found new walls, clerks wrote names in neat columns and placed incense before the lists. In the Marianas, men who had not wept in years found themselves blinking at odd moments, like on the walk between mess and tent, because repetition and magnitude wear on a spine in a different way than fear. In June, the pins crowded the map until it looked like a hedgehog. Air crews joked that the only way to miss a target was to aim at the ocean, and someone said, "Don't tempt fate," and everyone nodded because fate listens. The scale of ruin was not triumphal so much as functional. The machine would keep turning because the machine had been built to turn. Cities were running out before courage did. There is a smell to production that people who love machines can name. Cutting oil and hot steel, paint outgassing from a panel that just learned its curve. In America, that smell had become a continent-wide weather pattern by 1944. Assembly lines in Kansas and California taught aluminum to be air, tank farms taught liquid to be strategy, railroads taught distance to behave. A B-29's birth certificate carried more signatures than some counties' voting rolls, and each name represented a task that made flight not miraculous but expected. That was the victory, to make a miracle repeatable. Numbers that had begun life as slogans found themselves promoted to facts. 3,970 B-29s was not a threat. It was purchase orders filled, shifts paid, scrap reclaimed, and alloy poured. Northfield's 4 runways were not brag. They were 8 miles of practical argument laid parallel across coral, where hundreds of hardstands made geometry visible. Fuel farms glittered in the sun like lakes with discipline. Docks accepted ships thick as saw-teeth. The Seabees laid asphalt with the cheerful contempt professionals reserve for things that used to be impossible. Ellison would not have put it that way. He would have said the airplane started, that the run-up was clean, that he trusted the man with the wrench as much as the man with the bars on his collar. Morales would have said that men who do their job right don't get their names in books, which is unfair but tidy. The point, which both men carried without reciting, was that democracy had found a way to make competence contagious. The system did not need fealty, it needed reliability, and reliability multiplied itself under fluorescent lights and over mess tables. On the other side, scarcity had learned its catechism. 1 gallon for the truck, 1 for the generator, 1 for the fighter that would not scramble, 1 for the can that leaked. Pilots no braver than American pilots died for math rather than courage. Factories that wanted power collected promises instead. A foreman staring at a dead lathe learned to hate insulation with a precision he had once reserved for a rival's workmanship. In headquarters that still smelled faintly of lacquer and flowers, staff officers drafted plans to disperse industry into the countryside as if scattering would invent resources. The country answered with distances, with missing belts, with barns that were not factories. The doctrine incubated on the Marianas matured into habit. Night, low, incendiary, walk the wind, everyone in the chain could say the steps without looking at a board. Intervalometer rhythms became as musical as a drill cadence, and just as comforting. The Pathfinder's flare patterns turned into handwriting by which a nation signed its intent across a sky. The APQ-13 scope taught navigators to steer by a coastline they had never seen in daylight, and somehow the voices in the cockpit went quieter with each mission, not because men lacked words, but because repetition steals the need to narrate. Industrial democracy's advantage was not simply size, it was adaptability. When a turret gearbox tended to overheat, men in shirt sleeves wrote a fix and sent it the way one might send a recipe. When a landing technique saved a tire, the trick moved through squadrons like the rumour of a dance. The Japanese system, born of hierarchy and scarcity, could organise courage and sacrifice at an unmatched level, and often did, but could not create gasoline by decree or radar by will. Strategy in 1945 was engineering in public. If anyone wanted the metaphor made literal, the islands provided. Northfield's hardstands outnumbered the night fighters the enemy could put into the sky. The parallel runways looked like an abacus on which a democracy worked, sums the other side could not balance. Men slept under wings that weighed more than houses because the system had learned to make houses into wings, and then to replace both without slowing. All of it felt to the men living inside it like work hours and chow lines and forms, which is how miracles prefer to dress when they mean to be taken seriously. Years later, in a quiet room that smelled of paper and old varnish, Ellison unfolded a mission map, and the ash smudge in one corner surprised him with its persistence. He ran a finger along the course line from Tinian to a coastline drawn in disciplined dots, then across the flaming X someone else had made real. He would not have called it pride, exactly. He would have called it completion, the sense that the thing promised had been executed with the care a promise deserves. He remembered the updraft that lifted the superfortress like a kite. He remembered Morales's laugh at a latch that seated under a punch. He remembered coffee that could scour a conscience. The ledger of Meeting House lay open beside the map. The numbers were not shy anymore. History had fattened them. 16 square miles burned. 267,000 buildings gone. Between 87 and 100,000 dead, depending on which witness a person trusted. More than 1 million homeless before dawn. Deadliest single air raid in history. The phrases had been combed of adjectives until only nouns remained, and still they felt like shouting. He placed a palm over the page as if human warmth could soften paper. Keiko Arai would have placed incense instead. She would have said names, some aloud, some only in her throat because grief prefers privacy. She would have walked riverside markets rebuilt from boards and corrugated sheet and recognized the way people find normal in the vicinity of ruin. She would have watched a child tie a ribbon around a sapling planted where a house once leaned and would have understood that memory does not end. It grows bark. The whistle she had bitten until her teeth hurt lay in a drawer that survived because drawers are stubborn. Kume, older, would have stood at an air museum and stared at an airplane painted the wrong shade of green and thought how memory forgives such things. He would have read a placard that mentioned scarcity and nodded at its shorthand. He would have smiled at a boy asking where the guns were and felt the clean pang of a man who once wished for one more burst, one more minute of fuel, one more chance to put the reticle on a target that refused to hold still. He would have said, if asked, that bravery is cheaper than gasoline. The boy would not understand yet. That is the mercy of boys. Strategists wrote their post-war gospels with charts and bullets. They debated whether fire or fission had ended the war, whether blockade or bombing had broken spirit or supply first, whether doctrine or weather had held the winning vote. The arguments mattered because democracies argue as a way of keeping faith. Yet even among quarrelling experts there survived a consensus that the raid had revealed something essential, that a free people, furnished with factories and fed with ideas, could compress years of attrition into nights. The mathematics of production had acquired a human face and a smell, and once learned, such lessons do not go back to equations no one can taste. If the story needed an impossible statistic to pin it to the corkboard of memory, it had one that could not stop being true. By the summer of 1945, whole percentages of Japan's urban area lay burned, Tokyo near half, dozens of cities between a third and more, and the 20th Air Force could choose targets faster than the enemy could invent defences. A single island airfield, 4 runways, hundreds of hardstands, could host more operational heavy bombers than the Empire could put night fighters into the Kanto sky. A nation that once measured victory in aces and battleships now counted it in square miles per hour. Ellison folded the map. He thought of the engineer's hand on the throttle quadrant, of the navigator's pencil tracing bearings over the Pacific, of the radio operator's silence, of the bombardier's thumb. He thought of Morales's safety wires, of Seabees pouring coral like concrete, of stateside workers who had riveted aluminum into shapes that needed no argument to fly. He thought of Keiko's bucket, of Kume's needle dropping in its glass bowl, of a ledger that would never fit all its names. The arithmetic that ended empires had always been a sum of hands. He closed the ledger with the gentleness a man reserves for photographs and walked to the window. Outside, a tree moved in a clean wind, and the sound it made was ordinary and perfect, like a world that had learned to keep its promises.